His family didn't make up this story in denial. That family was robbed of their sunshine. Or as the defendant described him, one of her horrible husbands. If I'm guilty of anything, it's picking horrible husbands. That's in those messages that she says to reporters. That's her own words to someone that's in this room. You don't get to leave her. She leaves you. You heard that. When Sarah met Joe, she moved quick. Spider meet the fly. The defendant tells anyone who will listen with her whole chest her motives for killing Joe. I'm amazed at all he was able to keep hidden, she says about Joe to journalist Mary Ellen Swishow. According to her, he was bleeding her dry. He was leaving her in financial ruin, like David Bragg, also dead. He was lying. He was stealing. He liked porn. He was a slob. He didn't take care of himself. He was sneaking around and buying stuff at the corner store. He was emotionally abusive. He refused to get it together with his diabetes. She didn't want to take care of an invalid. So instead of just leaving him, or better yet, letting him leave her, she did the most obvious and natural thing to her, and she murdered him. She is screaming her motive to anyone and everyone that will listen. She was tired of him. He was taking too much from her. And those are her words about her beloved husband. This is not a doting wife who lost the love of her life as she initially was acting. It's not the polished woman with the jewelry and the Bible. It's the expletive screaming, vindictive, manipulative, always planning, always calculating woman. It's the actress Sarah Hartsfield. The embittered woman that wasn't going to take his shit anymore. We talked about roles during voir dire, and now is the time when the rubber hits the road on your duties that you owe. It is your turn. It is your opportunity to right the wrong that's been done to Joseph Hartsfield. Evaluate not what I say, not what defense counsel says. Evaluate the evidence. Decide what you believe. And you took an oath to listen to the evidence presented to you and to make your decision based accordingly. And as stated in the jury charge, your sole job right now is to determine guilt or innocence of the indictment. That's it. I've tried some cases that are what you could be called he said, she says, and it's generally assaults. And juries can sometimes struggle with that because in those cases, they're having to figure out, was there even a crime? Did something happen here? But we know something happened here. A man is no longer with us in his own home, killed by what can only be described as his worst nightmare. And the only person with him in that home is her. And the only way you can describe their relationship, if you read through the text messages, is that she had utter contempt for him. She knew he was trying to leave. She had a habit of doing real specific things whenever people tried to leave her. There were a lot of signs in this case. She waited as he lay dying for hours, almost an entire day, to call 911. She didn't want to ride in that ambulance. She was worried about her car. She didn't seem upset that he was dying. She seemed intent on punishing his family. She was obsessed with them. It's all she could talk about, that and forcing the stroke narrative, and then talking about how much of a pig and a piece of crap her beloved husband was. She copy and pasted nasty messages about his family and sent them out to anyone that would listen. And defense counsel told you in his opening statement, defendant gave Joe the insulin before he went to sleep. She wrote it too. They've already admitted to her handling the murder weapon repeatedly. Of course, she's not going to admit to doing it, but my God, how rare is it that we have this much evidence and the defendant literally admits to giving the murder weapon to the victim. Joe had benzos in his system when he got to the hospital, prior to the hospital administering them. I went through that in painstaking detail with Dr. Agogo. It's in the medical records. That was not given to him prior to him getting there. The defendant admitted to giving him Repinerol and Benadryl, which you heard testimony can cause you to go to sleep. It can make you drowsy. Joe, who wouldn't even take a Tylenol, had 3 medications in him. 3 medications in him. And all of them, you saw on the medical charts the defense counsel showed you, were prescribed to her. She had Valium. She had Repinerol. And she had Benadryl. And the defense counsel's own questions to Deputy Yateman phrased it perfectly. Narcotics like Valium can cause you to be very drowsy. They put you, and he said this, in a weakened state. Now he was, of course, talking about helpless Sarah. But isn't that just what she did to Joe? Drug him, overdose him, wait for irreparable brain damage, wait till he's throwing up. Well, now he's thrown up, so that's kind of obvious. So now I have to pretend like I'm a caring wife, call 911. But first, Facebook. Remember what she warned the family in World War III? Pardon my language, but she said, you'll never fucking see him again. She might not be a woman of her word, but she is a woman of her threats. According to the defendant, he also didn't want to eat it, but she made him his favorite food. This is the food that she knew would shoot his blood sugar straight up. But she made it for him. And he didn't want to eat it. And she says he didn't want to eat it, and I forced him to eat it. Is that how she got him to take all that medicine that Joe Hartsfield wouldn't have taken on his own? Defense counsel wants you to think that Joe was so non-compliant that he regularly took his insulin after he ate and before he went to bed. But in Dr. Anakawa's records, the note that he took the medicine after meals was information provided by her. She tells law enforcement that this man is utterly incapable. She can't leave him alone for even a little bit. He is just that helpless. He just needs her so much. And yet, she leaves him for chunks at a time. She acted like there was no life insurance. And sure enough, there was. And she was acutely aware of it. And also that she was the beneficiary on it. She hated his children. She hated his family. She didn't want him to have any connection with them. But he did. He just couldn't help but exist and make her angry. The defendant told law enforcement at her home that she and Joe had together decided to cut his family out of his life. And you heard that message. That boy loved his mama. You think he was going to cut her out of his life for her? She said in her own words, she's a behavioral analyst in the military. She's an intelligence analyst in the military. Now, I don't know what she was because those are two different things. She's something. Defense truly cannot cannot have Joseph's death related to low blood sugar, because in trying to cover her tracks, defendant repeatedly, consistently, obsessively said that it wasn't. So much so that she put it in his obituary. How many times are we reading an obituary of someone and we're curious what happened to him, but it's never in there, but it was in the one she wrote? That's why defense counsel has to try and confuse you with medical testimony when his neurologist and the medical examiner spoke unequivocally. He did not have a stroke that caused this. He had prolonged hypoglycemia that went untreated for too long because she sat there, she farted around, and she let it kill his brain. She caused it, and then she made sure it was irreversible. And sometimes that looks like a stroke, and you heard that very clearly. Sometimes it mimics a stroke. It looks like it, but that's not what she was dealing with. You have other signs. Her talking to her own daughter. This isn't a threat. How often do you feel like something's not a threat when someone precedes it with saying, this isn't a threat? What else does she say? As soon as I knew he was in trouble, I did everything I could to save him. Actions speak louder than words. Defendant said that to Ashley, but what a farce. She tells the hospital he didn't do drugs, and there's no indication of such. But then she accuses him of using cocaine and meth, and nowhere is it documented in hospital records of that. But she says, oh, the hospital told me his heart looked like a drug user. Maybe that's why all this was going on. She wasn't concerned about helping her husband dying. She was concerned about orchestrating her defense. That video cameras don't work, but then suddenly, wait, I do have this image where his face looks kind of off, so I'm going to go ahead and send that to try to convince the medical examiner to find something that is not supported by medical diagnoses and science. Defendant said, oh crap, when asked for her phone. She didn't want to give it up. She didn't want to turn it over, and now we know why, right? Because that's where some of the most damning evidence comes from. She's allegedly asleep. We know he's in the bed dying. And somehow, unconscious Joe, who's been laying there for hours, his phone sends this to the defendant, which she immediately saves to her phone. The new bank account and his driver's license. It's almost like she knew he was going to die, right? The Apple legacy account. She knew he was going to die because she made sure of it. How can she possibly feign ignorance after this? The Facebook messages with flat out lies about his blood sugar. Oh, he's been low lately. When his doctor and the data shows exactly the contrary. She deleted the text messages that she sent to her daughter when she was supposed to be asleep an hour and a half before she calls 911. And you know her butt is in the room with him because she's videoing him probably gasping for his last waking breaths. But first, Facebook. Let me go tell Carlene I'm gonna call 911. Thank God she did, I guess. Defendant tells a journalist there's no smoking gun in jail messages, but isn't every single one of her acts a smoking gun? When law enforcement went back into the house with an arrest warrant, she had a suitcase packed. And while defense would quibble with the integrity and credibility of Detective Rocks, she said, it's in the body camera. You could watch the body camera. But because it wasn't in her report, don't focus on it. She says he's the perfect husband. We have a good marriage. We weren't worried about divorce. And then all of a sudden, when the evidence is mounting, he is an abusive, drug-addicted, porn-loving, slobby piece of crap. And he's a thief whose family was the root of all evil. His family was worried, and they had every right to be. What a wild... I didn't have time to summarize all the evidence to you. There's not enough time in the day for me to go through it. But what a wild coincidence that no person can leave her without violent consequences. What a wild coincidence that as he is fighting for his life, she is setting this up. What a wild coincidence that she is setting up an alibi, a defense over Facebook while he was dying. While he was laying there and she was ordering groceries, bringing him inside, putting him on the table, recording him. As he laid dying, she laid planning. As investigators build the case, how coincidental that she packs a suitcase. And the irony, or tragedy rather, is that she wasn't happy either. And if she had just let him leave, none of us would be here today. She could have just let him go, but the spider doesn't let go of the fly. She's always working. We've laid out our cards. I'm not trying to hide things from you. I am trying to move things more quickly. I'm not trying to put on our witnesses in the best light. There are issues that we've had to address. And I can Monday morning quarterback, I can armchair quarterback all day on any given case things I wish that law enforcement can do. But it doesn't change the reality of this case. She admitted to handling the evidence. And she handled the evidence in front of the officers. And the cup, I can't say honestly that I care about, because what would that show you? She told them there was no video, but now we're mad at the officers for believing her. Defendant's actions, unfortunately, did impact law enforcement's decisions, and I wish that I could go back and I could have them collect those things, if for no other reason than to foreclose asinine arguments like that. But I'm not going to hide behind the fact that I do wish that they had gotten that evidence. But it doesn't change the medical examiner's testimony. It doesn't change her messages. It doesn't change her actions. You heard from the medical examiner. It is not their duty to determine how someone was injected with so much insulin to the point that they overdose. That is y'all's job. That is why that blank is left open. The medical examiner told you it would take something drastic, like a video of how the insulin was administered, for them to be able to do that. But it doesn't take that for y'all. You said out there it doesn't take that for y'all. At the very beginning of trial in voir dire, I showed you that picture. And we talked about the puzzle. And you all agreed that you do not look at evidence in a vacuum. You got it then, like you get it now. And the evidence is clear. And sometimes I have to rely on just one person's testimony. But that's not the case here. I'm not relying on a witness. I'm relying on y'all to have listened, to have paid attention. You heard from Detective Rocks. This case had more evidence tying the defendant to committing the offense than any she's ever had before. You heard who did it. Sarah. You heard where it happened. Chambers County. You heard when it happened. You can see when she did it. You know what happened. There were signs. Defense counsel said in their opening that Detective Rocks arrested the defendant immediately, but you know that's not true. She wasn't just some detective on a power trip doing a quick investigation. Detective Rocks did an incredibly thorough investigation. And while there is always room for improvement, I have no doubt how many people are going to tell me how much better I could have done on this. But that woman was on her first call out as a detective. And she did, from my perspective, an incredible job balancing the rights of the defendant, a thorough investigation, and the safety of our community. Keeping an eye towards justice. To drag her and to make this investigation worthless because she didn't get something that would have already had evidence on it, it's just another misdirection. Focus on the whole, not the whole picture. And I'm always cautious in opening because I want you to have a roadmap, but I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. I never know if a witness is going to become unavailable or just not cooperative. I don't know if they're going to remember everything or something else. It's always something in trial, and you saw that happen in the course of this trial, but I don't want my overpromises to you to mean that a killer goes free. But defense counsel sure did oversell. And they authoritatively told you that he died of something other than what he died of. Dr. Bainan, the medical examiner, was clear. She held his brain in her hand, and she knows what killed him. And she knows, and she told you that he did not have a stroke. I don't know what else you want. Defense counsel wants you to hold it against Joe's sister that she let the police know what she thought, and wants to argue with a grieving family member about the word accusation. But isn't it a little ridiculous to not expect your sister to fight like hell if they think that you're murdered? We could probably get a lot of college credit hours from the medical testimony that we heard. And all of it paints a really clear picture, even with some of the missing links the defense counsel wants you to focus on. She murdered him. And to theorize that this man, who was so terrified of low blood sugar that he DKA'd multiple times and would not comply for fear of being low, all of a sudden, when he was trying to leave the defendant, when he was scared of dying in his sleep, all of a sudden, he takes a bunch of drowsy-inducing medicine, overdoses himself on insulin, doesn't realize it, doesn't correct it, doesn't apparently respond to any of the things that defendant alleges that she did for him, apparently was mobile during the period when doctors said he wouldn't have been able to move around. It's just not reasonable. It's just not reasonable. It's an insult to your intelligence. The alerts went off over 100 times. She said she heard them. She had the alerts on her phone. So why would she say all that? Why would she tell on herself about the medicine? Because she knows reasonably that she's going to get looked at. And she's not dumb. She's actually quite smart. She does what I kind of do when I know that I've got some bad facts coming down the pike, and I address them. So what she did is weave them in. She tells one person one thing. She tells Aunt Nancy, well, I'll try to give him the water, and he said it tasted weird, just in case he wakes up. She tells law enforcement, well, I gave him I gave him his restless leg syndrome medicine and Benadryl. It wasn't his, it was hers. She weaves it in. So if she's caught, she says, well, I said it. I told him. I know as well as you do that what she did was intentional, what she did was knowing, what she did was unapologetic. The pieces that they try to put into the puzzle do not make sense. Defense counsel wants you to focus on the fact that he didn't eat right and he ran high, but he didn't die of running high. The defense counsel wants you to focus on the fact that Joe's family was concerned, and rightfully so. Defense counsel wants you to focus on the fact that they were pissed off, but not on why. Not on the fact that defendant walks by and incites the family. The family that knew that he was getting isolated. They almost got him out. Y'all, they almost got him out. But it's a problem whenever Jeannie is venting to her family. Defense counsel wants you to think that Sarah was high as a kite, incapable of doing such, and also don't hold it against her too much that she didn't help him and that she let him lay there helpless for 20 hours because she was high and she was in a weakened state. But you saw her. She drove herself to the hospital. Couldn't even be bothered to ride in there with him. She was on Facebook. She was ordering groceries, making sure the groceries are on the table. She said, "Hold on a minute, Carlene, I gotta call 911. Then she tells reporters, "I didn't ignore his Dexcom alert. I was on my own pain regimen in another room. I was sleeping most of the day and night." What story is it, Sarah? I'm sorry that it's taken a long time to go through this, but when someone tells that many dang different stories to that many people, there's so many things that you don't get to know about even. Defense counsel wants you to focus on things that aren't part of the jury charge. Defense counsel wants you to focus on, in 15-minute conversations with detectives, a person doesn't say every single thing that they think of. She's supposed to be a pharmacy tech that was so involved with his medical care that she would call his work to tell him to get a shot. She would call his doctor to correct him in his medical records. But then she pretends like she doesn't even know what kind of insulin he has, what they do. Defense counsel wants you to focus on the fact that AUSA's rejected a solid case about David George and the defendant's murder plot. And they want you to focus on Douglas County prosecutors originally coming up with a reason for not prosecuting when there was conflicting evidence on David Bragg, but not on the fact that they reopened it. Defense counsel wants you to focus on the fact that law enforcement failed Titus Controlled, but not that she was seen fleeing the scene. Defense counsel wants you to focus on an easy way out investigation, but not that the defendant left Brian Altus's home minutes before it caught on fire. Minutes after he rejects her. Defense counsel wants you to focus on wrongful convictions because that is terrifying. That's terrifying for me. That is horrifying. But they don't want you to focus on common sense. They don't want you to focus on the evidence. They don't want you to focus on probability. Defense counsel wanted you to focus on the burden, and I do too. My burden is a reasonable doubt. Defense counsel wants you to focus on duty of care or omission, but not on criminal responsibility. A person is criminally responsible if they cause the result. Defense counsel wants you to focus on elements that aren't there. You heard him add that, right? I can't prove my case to you if we don't know exactly how she got the insulin. That is not the law, ladies and gentlemen. But you aren't falling for that. That nagging feeling is not reasonable doubt if it's not reasonable. Defendant isn't charged with failure to render aid. Defendant is charged with murder. How much of defendant's clothes did he spend on the elements that he think we should have to prove? We spent 2 days on medical testimony, and we flew through extraneous offense testimony. Defense counsel has spent time with the experts on wild goose chases, like the sound of an alarm when the defendant's own words to multiple people are that she heard the alarms. What was the point of that? It is a distraction. Defense counsel wants you to think stroke and even continually tried to put that in the mouth of the neurologist. He wants you to focus on A1C, atherosclerosis, all of these things instead of the glaring issue that she overdosed him on insulin. Defense counsel said that the self-defense with regard to David Bragg was ironclad. When the detective told you it happened, it was reopened by the attorney. Defense counsel says there's no evidence in this case and doesn't want you to look over here. Defense counsel says that Detective Rock's rushed investigation and pursued it only on the basis of the family ignoring that even in the medical charts, the doctors were concerned there was foul play. Who the heck else is administering the insulin other than her? "20 hours. That's how long he laid there, but they don't want you to focus on that because that makes what she did real obvious. So instead, he's got to create these false gotcha moments with witnesses about testimony that either isn't their subject matter or it's just a distraction to focus from the literal mountains of evidence in the case. But that is what skilled defense attorneys do, and he is top notch. They try to take holes and tell you that it's doubt. They try to take information that we'll never get to know because murderers aren't in the business of telling us how they do it, and they try to wedge into it and say, you can't convict because you don't know this. That is not the elements of the offense. But it is effective. It is scary. But don't fall for it. The reality is what they're complaining about doesn't even push the needle either way. It wouldn't have proven her innocent. Would it have proven her guilty? No. You saw her handling them in the video. She admitted to touching them. He said it in his opening. She couldn't have had better representation than him, but the spider just can't help itself. She's got to spin her webs. And every time she talks, it's something different. And it's just not believable. And we're never going to get the whole picture because she took that from us when she let him suffer from irreversible brain damage. What you have are the witnesses that were available to prosecution this week. What you have is the mounds of evidence that really she created. You'll never have the whole picture. But trying to make sense of a crime isn't like that. There is no reasonable doubt. If I tell you 2 plus blank equals 4, you know what that blank is. And some of you might be thinking, it could be 2 or it could be 1 plus 1. But either way, you know what's in that blank, right? It's 2, one way or another. She doesn't get away with this because she was like kind of careful. Her story, the information presented to you, Her story is exactly like what Hannah Williamson, her former best friend, felt about one of the other stories. It's ludicrous. How stupid does she think you are? Page 1 of the medical records, hypoglycemic coma. Page 13, hypoglycemic coma. Page 27, hypoglycemic coma. Pages 128, 129, 132, 133, 150, 159. Did you notice when we were going through all this medical testimony, he didn't grill the neurologist the stroke questions. He grilled the ER doctor that. Did you notice that he asked Dr. Knight, the general practitioner, the diabetes questions, and he stood a little bit back on that from Dr. Inaqua. Notice how he grilled the cop about diabetes, but not the doctor treating Joe for it. Defense counsel knows who's been subpoenaed. They get that information. But what did they spend their time on, and who did they spend it with? Joe didn't have a DNR in place. And after intentionally introducing the amount of insulin into that man who was deathly afraid of insulin, so much so that she caused an overdose, his worst fears come to life. She takes it one step further and makes sure he's got a DNR. Even in recalling Dr. Inaqua, who testified that someone would have had to introduce that much insulin to his body, and it wouldn't be Joe. Defense tells you that there's no evidence. This is about possibility versus reasonableness. The trial is the state of Texas versus Sarah Hartsfield, but it's really bigger than that, isn't it? This is about what is okay in Chambers County. You may get away with devious, ingenious, devastating crimes like this in another county. You can really, really be skillful, premeditated, deliberate, and convincing in another state. And they may not have the investigators willing to spend countless hours in the trenches, or juries who demand to hold people accountable. But here, U12 can draw a hard line. In other places, people may get away with committing murder right in front of people's faces, but you don't have to do that here. There is no reasonable doubt. You know what happened in that video. You know what happened in that video, and you know what happened here. The only reasonable conclusion is that this person committed that crime, and it's your job to convict her, and it doesn't bring me joy to do that. I have no doubt that she has suffered in her life, but that doesn't absolve her of taking that man's life in the exact way that he was most fearful of. And defense counsel made very valid arguments about not trusting the government in voir dire. But you don't have to trust the government. You don't have to trust me to see that this is a crime. You just have to trust your own eyes, your ears, your gut, your instincts, your judgment. Sometimes it really is the most obvious answer. And when I showed you these elements, every single one of you said that you did not have a problem with this. And that's the case. We'll never get to know how she did it because she orchestrated this whole thing. Joe had medications in his system by her own admission and by medical testimony and records that weren't prescribed to him when he wouldn't even take Tylenol. In voir dire, I asked you this question. There's only two people that could have administered this much insulin to him. There's absolutely no evidence that Joe did this to himself. And there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that the defendant did this intentionally and knowingly. And when I asked you this question, none of you raised your hand to say you weren't a 10. And if you don't hold her accountable, this is not going to stop. And I'm just going to tell you, if it's between my loved one or yours, I know who I hope it is. Here is me standing before you with more evidence than I have in an overwhelming amount of cases. And this is your opportunity to take these cases seriously. Y'all are the heartbeat of the community. And you can decide to take it seriously or to wash your hands of the victim and say something probably happened, but I'm not 100% sure, when you know darn good and well that is not the burden. Put yourself in his family's shoes. What would justice be for the woman who did this to him and then watched him? She recorded his breathing and made fun of it. And I hope that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. When I was a senior in high school, my stepdad was diagnosed with ALS, and that's Lou Gehrig's disease. And he survived for 5 years, and he was a heck of a fighter. And he went through more with that than, from my perspective, any mere mortal could. And in his last days in the hospital, he had bilateral pneumonia. At that point, he couldn't walk. He couldn't talk. He couldn't eat on his own. It's a terrible way to die. It really is. And he made the decision that he didn't want to be intubated. And we knew that that was the end. And the last moments of my dad's life, I'll never forget. They took everything off of him. And they had given him medicine so that he could go to sleep. And we were in the room, and I got to hold his hand. And a nurse sang him. It was like it's surreal. I can still feel myself being back in that room. And I knew that my dad was dying. I knew that he couldn't breathe. And it was terrible, and it was painful, and it was one of the worst days of my life. But in that, it was also peaceful, and it was beautiful because he had made that decision, and we got to be there with him. And he was living on his own terms, and he was dying on his own terms. And this case has, if I'm being honest, really sucked for me, because she robbed Joe not just of his life, she robbed him of his death. And she robbed his family of that peace and of that goodbye. And for what? For what? Like, what was the point of her doing this? You've heard it from defense since Fort Dyer. It's not her fault. He had these other health issues. And as great of an attorney as Mr. Darwin is, and he is, it's plain as day. It wasn't ever about her duty to save him. It was about her duty not to cause his death, not to cause him needing to be saved. This is not a doctor missing golf to not help a stranger. This is a lying and murderous wife who drugged her husband, overdosed him on insulin, and then just sat there and ordered groceries and complained about him while he was laying there dying in the way that he was most terrified of. And my job requires me to walk among monsters, and my faith calls me to fear no evil. But as a resident of this community, the idea that she can get up and walk out of here with the rest of us terrifies me, and I hope it terrifies you. Because there is no question if she will hurt another person. It is when, and it is who. And defense counsel asked you in voir dire, how do you want to feel when you leave this courthouse? And I hope your answer is the same as mine, to see that justice is done. 45. and it would be a grave injustice. What a triumph of bad to acquit the woman who did this to Joseph Hartsfield in such a terrible and calculating way. She is not Richard Jewell. She is not the hero that they brought up in voir dire. She is who we have to be protected from. She is not a kind and loving person. She is not this person who's been wrongfully accused. She is, unfortunately, for all of us, a murderer. Now, I asked you that question in voir dire. What does a murderer look like? And now you know, because she's sitting right there. And it's your job to find her guilty and hold her accountable. Thank you.